or build my own. Obviously. Since it's cheaper to build one, and presumably more fun because you get to build the expensive Legos you bought, I decided to go down that path. This is where I immediately hit a wall. What should I spend my doubloons on? I wrote down all the parts my PC will need and then started the research. Compared a bunch of processors, motherboards, GPUs, looked at benchmarks, whether the parts are compatible, and after 2 long weeks, they arrived. The processor, AMD Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. The processor, cooler, Thermalite Peerless Assassin 120SE. The RAM, Corsair Vengeance DDR5 32GB. The storage, Crucial P3 Plus 2TB M.2 PCIe Gen 4 NVMe internal SSD. These names. The motherboard, Asus Prime 650B Plus. The power supply, Corsair RM850E. The graphics card, AMD Radeon RX 7800 XT. The case, Corsair 4000D Airflow. I leave the list of parts in the description, so let's put them together. The first thing I learned from watching a bunch of PC build tutorials is to first plug in the power supply, make sure to turn it on, and then every time I move my feet, just touch the metal part of it to get rid of the static electricity. I moved it to the side and tried not to forget to do it. Next, everything goes into the motherboard, so I unpacked that, and there's also a handy manual in the box which tells you where all the things should go. I also found it online. Then we have the I/O shield and some cables. The first thing I'm going to install is the CPU, the processor. It goes here in the middle. I first had to push down this lever, which was way harder than anticipated, lift it up, and then the cover, and there was this little triangle on one of the sides. There's also one on the CPU. So I made sure they align and carefully put it into the socket without applying any pressure. This was scary. And then I wiggled it a bit to make sure it's seated correctly, and everything seemed to be fine. Also, if you don't find that triangle, you can align the CPU using these cutouts on each side. Then I lowered the lid, and all that was left was to push the lever down and lock it in place. Again, I expected this to require way less pressure, but eventually I got it down there. That's what he said. The lid popped open and we're good to go. Also, don't throw this out because I heard Linus say that if you do and you want to return your motherboard, they might not accept it. Next, the RAM. According to the motherboard's manual, if I have 2 sticks of RAM, I need to install them into the gray slots, the middle one and the outside one, for the best performance. I lowered these things on the side, the other side didn't have them, then aligned the RAM sticks with a little gap in the middle and pushed on both sides with equal force until I heard a click. Once again, I expected I'll need a little less force than I did. Beautiful. And next was where things didn't go too smooth. It was time for the SSD storage. During this whole build, I had the Linus FOV PC building tutorial open, and for some reason I thought, I know how to install an SSD. So here's what I did. There are 2 spots on this motherboard for NVMe SSDs. These are regular SSDs that plug in with the SATA cable, and these are NVMe, which plug in straight into the motherboard. So one was here under this metal cooling thing, and another one here. So I unscrewed the cooling thing with my Swiss Army knife. By the way, it has some thermal paste under it, so don't forget to peel the plastic or it will render it useless. So next, I inserted the SSD at an angle into the slot, and then this was the mistake. You see, this SSD didn't come with anything else other than a little screw. So I thought, yep, all I need to do is screw it in. As I was doing it, I thought it was kind of weird that the SSD was bending a little bit. And then it even popped out as I was screwing it in. So then I thought, nah, this should be fine. Then I peeled off the plastic cover from the shield, installed the shield, looked at it for a little bit, and decided to resume the Linus tutorial. Turns out that inside of the motherboard box there were these SSD spacers which I should have installed first before I screwed in the SSD. So I quickly took off the cooling shield and you can see that it was only touching it in a few spots, which means that the SSD was bent. So I installed the spacer and then everything was fine. Next was time for the cooler on top of the CPU. The instructions for AMD said I only needed to remove these plastic things and leave the original backplate in place. If this was an Intel CPU, I would have to change the backplate underneath the motherboard as well. Then I had to install the metal brackets with screws and metal standoffs. Everything came in the box. The red ones are the ones I needed because it said AM4, AM5 on them. It took a little bit of processing to figure out how everything goes in, but the manual helped me out again. First the red things, then the bent metal brackets on top, but upside down, and finally the screws. I tightened them, but not over tightened. Then I applied the thermal paste in this cross pattern with dots on each side. Not too much, not too little. Finally, it was time to put in the cooler. There's a sticker on the bottom, so make sure to take it off, otherwise your processor will cook. I aligned it onto the screws, from the third attempt and then tightened them bit by bit on each side until I felt hard resistance. Beautiful. This cooler has 2 fans and the fan connector is right there. Also, air comes in from the nicer part of the fan and blows out the backside where the rails are. So I want to install it this way so that the air comes in from the front and goes out the back of the motherboard. This is the backside because of the I/O, like your USB and audio connectors. So they'll be at the back of the case where air comes out. I also learned that you don't want negative pressure inside your case, meaning that there should be the same amount or more fans pushing air in than out. No? Yes. Each fan has a cable and it plugs in here next to the CPU. It will be labeled CPU fan. So I rotated the fan so that the cable just barely makes it to the connector for nice cable management. To attach the fans to the cooler, there were these metal clips included in the case, so I installed them to the outer side of the fan and then clipped it onto these parts of the cooler. The other fan should go in the same way, so air in this side and air out that side. I put on the clips and installed it as well. It was time to connect the cables. This splitter came in the box with the cooler, but I thought it would ruin my nice cable management, so I plugged in one fan into the CPU_fan connector and the other one into the AIO pump. That's because Linus did the same in his tutorial. Turns out AIO pump stands for all-in-one pump, and it's just a more powerful connector, which means that the fan will spin faster. I want them spinning the same, so hopefully later in the BIOS I'll be able to set their speed to be the same. Now only later I found out that I could have plugged in the other one here, CPU_opt for optional, and not have to deal with the BIOS fan control, but let's pretend I did it for the cleaner cable management. Next, it was time to bring out the case. The motherboard came with the I/O shield, so to not forget, I installed that first. It goes in the top left of the case, so I aligned it and pushed each corner in until I heard a snap. On my motherboard, there were 9 holes for it to screw into the case. So here I was checking if there were no extra things poking out that could scratch the back of it. There's a pin in the middle, which isn't a screw, but it will go in the middle hole. Also, the standoffs that lift the motherboard slightly from the back of the case were also pre-installed. Double-checked everything, no extra things poking out. So it was time to put it in. That's what he said. I first installed it with the I/O shield at a little bit of an angle to not scratch the back, and then made sure I can see each screw hole through the top. Seemed pretty good to me. I then randomly chose a pack of screws that came with the case. Started opening the pack on the top, but then realized that if a screw falls in and I don't find it, it might be a big mistake. So I removed myself from the situation and then fastened in the motherboard with all 8 screws. Then I decided to connect the case fan cables to the motherboard. The top left one connects here, but the connector on the motherboard had 4 pins and this cable had 3 holes. The math didn't add up. Turns out it means that this fan consumes less power, and it's okay to plug it in as long as I align it well with the thing on the back. So I tried to cable manage the best I could and eventually plugged it in. The other fan's cable was quite long, so I routed it through the back of the case and it popped out here. Then I also plugged it into the connector labeled CHA fan, presumably meaning chassis fan. And boom, there was nothing left to do on this side, so I moved to the back. On the back of the case, there were these cables that connect the front I/O to the motherboard. This is the USB 3.2 cable, the USB-C cable, the power switch with its LEDs. I knew that connecting this will be interesting, the front audio jack, and the reset button. Let's begin with the audio cable. It has one blank pin near the edge, and it goes in there, labeled AAFP, means analog audio front panel. So I routed it through the back and carefully plugged it in, trying not to bend the pins. Next, I chose the USB-C cable and routed it through the side because it plugs in here. Took me a bit of thinking, but it goes in both ways, so it's pretty hard to screw this one up. Nice. Then the USB 3.2. From watching tutorials, I've heard that the pins on this one are really fragile and the connector is beefy, so it's easy to bend them. It goes in here. There's also a blanked out pin on the top left, so I carefully aligned that one with the missing pin on the connector and slowly pushed it in. Nice. Next, I had this cable galore to deal with. All of them somehow go in this part of the motherboard. I opened the manual for this to make sure I don't do something you'd see in Electro Boom's videos. Earth. And started with power LED plus and minus. Now I could have either plugged them in here at the top, but I didn't see it when I was building, so I opted for the place which would make connecting the other ones a lot harder. So I plugged both LEDs there with the words facing down like this. Then I targeted the power switch. It goes into these 2 pins, and I also did it words facing down. And finally, the reset switch. This one goes into these 2. I think, right next to the positive LED. So I plugged it in. Here's how everything looks. These are the LEDs, the power switch, and the reset switch below it. I've dealt with the cables I had, so it was time to put in the power supply. It goes in here at the bottom, and it took me a second to figure out that I was pushing against the back of the case here and not the power supply, and that's why it wasn't moving back. Yeah, that's what we're dealing with. I screwed in the provided screws and then realized I can't reach in and plug in the cables, so I unscrewed it. That's what we're dealing with. Now, the cables. It came with many cables in the box, but for this build, I'm only going to need 3. The first is this motherboard cable that provides power to it. Well, they all provide power to it. The power supply. The part that splits apart goes into the power supply and the other end into the motherboard. Then we have the PCIe cable for the graphics card. The ends where it says PCIe goes into the graphics card, and the end with some weird numbers goes into the power supply spot labeled PCIe/CPU. Not very nice. Then we have the CPU cable, very hard to tell apart. The part with the numbers goes into the power supply again. Now I spent some time explaining all the cables that the power supply comes with, only to realize that there was a picture on the side of the box that did it for me. Very nice. Now that they were all in, I rotated the power supply and screwed it back in. It was time to plug everything in. I routed the CPU cable through the front because it plugs in here, and then somehow pushed it into the connector. Looks pretty good. Next, the beefy motherboard cable. It has this clipping mechanism on one side, just like all 3 of those cables, so I had to rotate it around, which took a little bit of wrestling, but eventually I got it in. And the last cable that was left went into the graphics card, which I hadn't yet put in the case, so it was time to do that. The graphics card goes in here, so I needed to unscrew this one and this one for it to fit. Then, just like with the RAM slots, I put this plastic thing down and brought in the beast. A few cables were getting in the way, but I eventually aligned it with the cutouts on the left and the slot that it goes into, and pushed it firmly on both sides to slide it in. Then fastened it with the screws and it was installed. Back to the cable. This is where the struggling began. First, I decided to route it through the top here, where there were already a bunch of other cables in the way. So I reconnected the USB-C cable to make space for the graphics card cable. And then I wiggled it through the hole. Okay, it didn't seem to want to get in there, but I eventually got it to surrender. It was only then that I realized that the cable needed to be upside down from the location of these clips, and I immediately knew that it would have been better to route it through the bottom. And while putting it through here was difficult, pulling it back was 10 times harder. That's what he said. I couldn't resist. I struggled for a good 4 minutes to finally pull it out. Okay, then I routed it through the bottom, which was way easier because there were no extra cables in my way, and plugged it